So, the Reserve Bank of India has a new chief.
Meet Sanjay Malhotra, the newly appointed governor who steps into the office on December 11, 2024, succeeding Shaktikanta Das.
I would like to take this opportunity to convey my best wishes to the incoming governor, Sri Sanjay Malhotra, a person with a very wide experience.
Sanjay Malhotra will take over as RBI governor for a period of 3 years. He takes over at a time when he is, facing tough challenges on both growth as well as inflation.
It's not going to be smooth sailing.
Well, it never is smooth sailing for almost any central bank head in the world. But Malhotra comes in with brilliant academic and professional credentials. A computer science topper from IIT Kanpur and a Princeton University alumni, Malhotra held positions of Financial Services Secretary and Revenue Secretary at the Ministry of Finance before making his move to Mint Street. He has been a key mind behind shaping many of India's tax policies and has played an important role in improving the health of public sector banks. Here's Malhotra in his first press briefing as RBI governor talking about his priorities from his previous role that would continue in the current one.
Stability in policy again, very, very important, and this is something, even in my previous role, we try to give a stability, a continuity in policy. So whether it is taxation policy or fiscal policy or monetary policy, I think all businesses, all people, they do need this continuity and stability rather than, a day-to-day kind of a policy. So we continue to uphold this value, this principle.
Stability, yes, and also balance will be critical attributes for him going ahead. Remember, Malhotra takes over the reins of the central bank just weeks after India received a jolt in its latest GDP numbers. They grew at a 2-year low rate of 5.4% last quarter. Meanwhile, inflation remains high, and so the eternal central bank balancing act of growth and inflation just became a lot tougher. Malhotra also comes in as the RBI is engaged in a debate with the government on whether its inflation tracking mechanism and so ultimately its monetary policy framework should be changed. A suggestion repeatedly made by the chief economic advisor V. Anantha Nageswaran. Malhotra also takes over weeks before another expected rate cut by the US Fed, which raises questions on whether India will follow suit. There are other questions too. Will he stick to his predecessor Shaktikanta Das's hardcore negative position on crypto at a time when the Trump government is backing it so hard? Also, will he stick to the RBI's tough stance on NBFCs, for instance? Several questions. Let's try and unpack them one by one with our guests in today's episode. It's Tuesday, the 17th of December. I'm your host Anirban Chaudhary, and this is the Morning Brief. My colleague Deepshikha Sikarwar, National Editor Economics at ET, has known Malhotra since his stints at the Finance Ministry. I asked her to describe him for me.
So, Sanjay Malhotra's been in the central government for some time. He was in the Power Ministry. Then he came to the Finance Ministry as Secretary in the Financial Services Department before he was moved to the Revenue Department. The one key feature that sort of strikes out about Mr. Malhotra is that he is a very quiet, reticent man. But someone, when facing a lot of questions, he will come up with a more succinct and a sharp answer, a sharp response. So he is that quiet, reticent person, but someone who is taking views of all along, all officials along. He will listen to all stakeholders. He will try to take the best possible decision in that circumstance, taking everyone along everyone's views. So all inputs would be taken. So if you've seen his stint at the Revenue Department, there have been many facilitation measures. He's tried to resolve very knotty issues. Even if you've seen him in GST Council, he's been very firm when a decision has been taken and explained it to everybody. So that is Sanjay Malhotra for you.
And he also happens to have, which is not a surprise, happens to have a brilliant academic background. I think he was a computer science topper in his day.
Absolutely, he's known as a maths genius. So, which is why he was very comfortable with the numbers in the revenue department. And Anirban, if you remember, he was also a financial services secretary before becoming the revenue secretary. He was also on the Reserve Bank of India board. So he is very well versed with the issues and the challenges that the central bank faces as a central bank, as a banking regulator. He understands the issues, he understands the policies, he also knows the stakeholders. So I think he is not someone who's an outsider or who's been paratrooped there.
And any examples in his previous stint where he's come across as a strong decision maker or sent out a very strong message? Because I guess that would be critical in his new role as the RBI governor.
You know, his last public statement at Directorate of Revenue Intelligence function, he sent out a very strong message to the revenue officials, to balance out, not to go in for very high pitched notices, which have ramifications for the industry. So while, he is a revenue person, he wants his revenues, but he is also telling the tax officials to strike a balance. Not that they should stop action, but they should bring about some kind of balance in their actions so that they don't end up hurting the industry and the larger economy. So he's a person who knows how to balance interests, how to take a very balanced decision. And I think that is something that would come in handy at RBI, where you
Absolutely.
would be managing very conflicting interests.
Now, Malhotra's career trajectory, that of an IAS officer to a top finance ministry official to now the central bank chief, is not uncommon for this position. I asked Shugato Ghosh, associate editor ET, if a bureaucrat is always best suited for this job.
A large number of RBI governors have been bureaucrats historically. Some of the bureaucrats were trained economists as well, like Dr. Rangarajan, Bimal Jalan, Dr. Y.B. Reddy, and they had had absolutely stellar innings. But the government's experience with pure economists, like Dr. Raghuram Rajan or Dr. Urjit Patel, have not been particularly good. So there were sharp differences, some of which had boiled over in public, both left on a sour note. So today there is a different kind of a realization in the sense that while as an institution, RBI must preserve its legacy and a degree of independence. At the same time, there is a greater understanding, or I would say an acknowledgement, that New Delhi and RBI should work together because we have had far too many nasty surprises like the war, the pandemic, and all these things. So, under the circumstances, I would say that Dr. Malhotra, though a surprise choice, meets the requirements.
Why did you call him a surprise choice?
Well, he was not among the persons who were widely being speculated, particularly because he was a low profile. So it's not a name which kind of cropped up in the guessing game.
Talking about briefs and challenges and immediate ones for Mr. Malhotra, there is some chatter about a possible review of the monetary policy framework in 2025. What do you think this will mean for the new governor?
Well, it would all depend on what they want to achieve. This is a structure where RBI is given the job of inflation targeting. Now, there is a tolerance band of 2 to 6%. Now, if you increase or change the tolerance band, I don't think you have to change the law. But if you have to exclude food inflation from headline inflation, in that case, a change in the law would be required. And that is where there would be a delicate handling of the situation that the new governor would have to do. Because he has to convince the rank and file within RBI that this is the right thing to do, or he has to oppose it. So at this point, we don't know. At this point, we don't know what the government wants, to what extent the framework could be changed, if at all it is changed. If the changes are very big, how Malhotra would respond to it. how he persuades the people within RBI if the change is dramatic.
Right, so that's quite a task for him because obviously you mean that the debate about excluding food inflation from the headline inflation numbers is far from over.
Absolutely, because nothing happens without a reason. Even though the chief economic advisor said that it was his personal view, but soon after he broached the idea in a news article last few months ago that food inflation should be excluded, there has been a barrage of, there has been a string of debate, and the point was even highlighted by some of the senior ministers. So it's no longer a personal view, particularly when food prices have contributed to inflation. And there have been times when inflation crossed the tolerance level. So I believe it was flagged off very consciously. And it will reach a point where this particular issue will have to be handled. And it would be far easier for a new governor who is a low profile person to do this than somebody who was not particularly in favor of it.
So a clean slate and reticence will help. So 2024 was marked by the RBI's really terse stance on a lot of things, be it NBFC or the review of its attitude towards cryptocurrencies. Do you think there could be some change in its stance, even if in a small way, going forward under him?
I don't think the stance on crypto would be decided by RBI entirely, though RBI would have a big say in it. But hypothetically, if the government is more willing to accept crypto or talk about it, for instance, if you remember, the government is yet to come out with a white paper. It was supposed to by end September. The industry is still waiting for it. Today, crypto is not in the priority of the government. But suppose it moves up a few notches. In that case, what would RBI do? Under the previous governor, it was very clear they were absolutely opposed to crypto. And even though Dr. Das has been, most of his responses on many issues were very nuanced and diplomatic, as far as crypto was concerned, he left no ambiguity that he was opposed to it. He considered it as an absolute bubble, a kind of a Ponzi. But my bet is that the present governor may be more willing to approach it with an open mind. I don't think he would be endorsing it right away. He wouldn't be opposing it outright. But he may be willing to have a conversation, and that is particularly because the changes that is happening with crypto in the US. Right. Now, the point is that when El Salvador or Bhutan or some other smaller country flirts with crypto, you can ignore. When US does it, even if it is absolute madness, you must try to figure out is there a method in the madness.
And what about NBFCs? Do you see that stance softening as well, some breather for the small banks?
No, I don't think so, because those were steps taken by Dr. Das to de-risk the sector. The indebtedness of households has gone up. So there were clear evidence that there was some kind of a pockets of bubble in short-term loans. And the NBFCs were undertaking, at least some of them were undertaking sharp practices. So once a regulator spots that some of the members of the constituency in the financial services sectors are indulging in sharp practices, you have to take measures to de-risk the sector. Now, abroad, you can impose heavy fines. You can't do that here. So the alternative is to ask them to stop operations for a few months. Now, that is where the RBI also came under attack, because a part of the slowdown in consumption is being attributed to the crackdown on NBFCs. Right. So, but then as a regulator, he couldn't have done less. So I don't think Dr. Malhotra would be rolling back the measures on the NBFCs. And RBI has made it very clear that it doesn't want a kind of regulatory arbitrage between banks and NBFCs. So if a bank can't do anything, it should not use an NBFC to do it. It's NBFC arm, right? They want to minimize this regulatory arbitrage. So I don't think from that position they would be deviating significantly.
Shugato, in a recent article, you spoke about the monetary policy as very similar to politics, which you referred to as the art of the possible. What did you mean by this?
Well, no governor can distance himself or herself from the political economy. the compulsions of political economy, particularly if you have a vibrant democracy like India. On one hand, you have this set of compulsions and priorities, or obligations, if I may say. On the other hand, the world is ravaged by more and more imponderables. Now, you have global warming, which is causing unseasonal rains, which in fact affected the mining activities so much that your GDP fell for the second quarter. You have, in a few years down the line, you will find the disruptive forces of AI. These are elements you don't know the how geopolitics will play out, what will happen to oil. Well, these uncertainties were there always, but we can almost feel every day things are changing. So in future, the job of the central bank governor would be far more challenging.
So then let's talk about the challenges. First, the slowdown in growth. Here's Indranil Pan, Chief Economist at Yes Bank.
The slowdown, in my opinion, is more due to the fiscal headwinds that we are seeing. And by that, I mean a lower capital expenditure that is happening from the center's level. And in the absence of a significant amount of push from the private consumption expenditure, which also likely is lower because of the higher inflation in the economy and more specifically the food inflation. The government therefore needs to spend and achieve its capital expenditure budget for growth to revive to a certain extent. Now, having said that, I think one of the other factors that we also are noting is that there is a perceptible downward momentum that we see in terms of the inflation. While most of the expectations that we see, either from the macroeconomists or from the government, or even at the last Monetary Policy Committee statements that we hear, growth is likely to be relatively better in the second half than in the first half. So, yes, the monetary policy is important, but I think more important to me at this point in time is how the fiscal policy responds, because they do have space within the fiscal at this point in time as the capital expenditures are running below budget. And as we have seen various governors speak on inflation and its relation to growth, I think a sustained handle or a low level of inflation in the economy is necessarily for a sustained growth pattern in the economy.
Understood. Now, talking about global influences, everyone's sort of looking to Fed and which way it'll move this month. If there is a small rate cut, how do you think that'll change things for us?
In my opinion, 25 basis points rate cut, which the markets are factoring in already at this point in time, doesn't really change the equation much for the Indian central bank, because the Indian central bank will continue to rely on its domestic data of the inflation and growth balances that we talked about. On the inflation perspective, the levers are more from the monetary side. And after having passed through a 6.2% inflation and then a 5.5% inflation, the comfort in terms of the food inflation still not being there, I think it is too early to say that we will be able to follow the Fed. So the Fed has already cut by 75 basis points. Another 25 basis points will make it 100 basis points cut by the Federal Reserve. The response to that has been more in terms of changing the stance of the Reserve Bank of India into a neutral from a restrictive. And they have also sort of allowed liquidity to be more easier with the CRR cut and sort of neutralizing the impact of the forex sales that they have been doing in the market. And to that extent, I think it's very difficult to call for a rate reduction following directly out of the Fed's action at this point.
But sir, isn't a rate cut necessary for growth, especially by way of unlocking, long bottled up capex cycles of the private sector?
Yes, you are right in saying that the corporates are mostly cash rich, and there is not much of an intention today of a private capex build out because of the lack of visibility of demand in the economy, not only the domestic economy, but also from the rest of the world. If we do rate cuts, it will bring down the EBLR and could provide a bit of an impetus in terms of the loans to the personal segment. But on the other side, from a risk perspective, the RBI had raised the risk weightages on most of the unsecured loans. And my feeling is that that is likely to continue irrespective of the change of guard at the central bank. And if that continues, then the pace at which unsecured loans can grow, and which was something that was actually fueling economic momentum from the personal consumption side, could continue to suffer. And therefore, the weighing has to be done very clearly whether we need to push growth and sacrifice financial stability, which I do not think would be the RBI's perspective.
The central bank has intervened pretty heavily in the last 1 year, and dollar sales have also mopped up liquidity quite a bit. Do you think that they would continue with the same level of interventions under the new governor, Mr. Malhotra?
I think the overall sort of atmosphere is of dollar strength. You cannot sort of wish away the emerging market currency depreciation. And therefore, India also has to sort of follow in line. Most of the other currencies have depreciated more heavily than India, which necessarily means that there could be a bit of a room for the currency, for the RBI to allow the currency to depreciate a little bit more. But having said that, I don't think any central bank would want excessive volatility and very sharp movements in currency. So if the need of the hour be that the currency needs to depreciate because the dollar is strengthening and the CNY is also weakening, I think the RBI would be happy enough to allow sort of a gradual weakening of the currency. And that, to a certain extent, also will help the economy maintain competitive power in a worsening trade scenario of the globe.
Mr. Pan, thank you so much for your thoughts. It was lovely chatting with you.
Thank you very much.
That's it for today. You were listening to this episode on The Morning Brief. It was produced by me and Surohini Jain, sound designed by Rajas Naik. The Morning Brief drops every Tuesday, Thursday and Friday. Keep listening wherever you get your podcasts. All clips used in this episode belong to their respective owners. Credits are mentioned in the description.